So we're just kind of do a flyover as we get up to chapter 34. Israel was enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. God miraculously delivers them through 10 plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the destruction of Pharaoh's army. In the process, God proves that he's their redeemer. In Exodus 19 through 24, God establishes a covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. In chapter 20, he gives them the 10 commandments and the law, teaching them how he expects them to live as his people. And early on, they eagerly agreed in Exodus 24:7, saying that all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. This is important. God's given them law, how he expects them to live, and every one of them says, yes, that is what we will do. That was in 24. By Exodus 32, they've completely forgot about that. And while Moses is on Mount Sinai, the people grow impatient. They created a gold calf saying, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. God has just displayed incredible might and power through the 10 plagues, through the Red Sea, through bringing them out of Egypt. He's made a covenant with them saying, this is how we will live. They've said, yes, everything you've said we will do. And 40 days later, 40 days later, they've constructed a calf out of their own possessions that they've melted down and shaped to themselves and said that this is the God who brought us out of Egypt. God is ready to destroy Israel. You can understand that at that point. But Moses pleads on their behalf. God relents, but still brings a level of judgment that results in 3,000 people perishing. And his presence seems uncertain moving forward. They may have found themselves wondering, okay, he didn't destroy all of us. Is he still going to be with us? We're not quite sure. In Exodus 33, Moses intercedes again, pleads to God on behalf of Israel, asking for God's presence to remain with them. In response to Moses' request, God reveals his glory and does so in a special way. God allows Moses to see God's back. But we're about to find even something greater in how God reveals himself. And that is where we find ourselves today. If you walk away with nothing else here, I want you to walk away with this idea. As we dive into talking about compassion, the idea is going to be how we as a community, as a faith-based community, exercise compassion. But before we determine and talk about how we are going to exercise compassion, we need to first recognize that if we're going to exercise compassion, it needs to be a reflection of God's compassion. The idea I want you to walk away with is that God's compassion is both his self-revelation. It's a revelation of who he is and his invitation. If you're taking notes, I'll say it again. God's compassion is both his self-revelation and his invitation. As recipients of God's mercy, as people who walk under his mercy and grace, we're called not only to understand his heart, not just to capture it here, but to embody it in everything we do, living as reflection of his love and his justice in a world that's broken. This leads us to Exodus 34. Verses 1 through 6 say this. Then the Lord told Moses, chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first one. I will write on them the same words that were on the tablets you smashed. Be ready in the morning to climb up Mount Sinai and present yourself to me on the top of the mountain. No one else may come with you. In fact, no one is to appear anywhere on the mountain. Do not even let the flocks or herds graze near the mountain. So Moses chiseled out 2 tablets of stone like the first one. Early in the morning, he climbed Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him, and he carried the 2 stone tablets in his hand. Then the Lord came down in a cloud and stood there with him, and he called out his own name. Yahweh, the Lord, passed in front of Moses, calling out, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. So where are we at? God tells Moses to chisel 2 new stone tablets. Why is he chiseling out 2 new stone tablets? Yeah. He comes down, he sees the idolatry, and in the haste, he breaks the tablets that were first given to him. We see, even at this, before we've even dived very deep, it doesn't take long to see God's compassion even in just that. He has every right to reject them. If any parent has ever had a child break something that they spent good money on, and then the child comes and says, can we get a new one? You broke the first one I gave you. Why would I give you another? I'm not wasting money on that. God, instead of rejecting his people, chooses to restore what was broken. As we look forward to inviting folks who maybe have felt like their opportunity, their relationship, their walk with God has been completely broken. Even in the very start of this story, we can see that God's heart is not to reject or to push away, but instead to reject. Not to reject. That's the exact same thing saying he doesn't do. But to restore what has been broken. Have you ever messed up and thought, well, that's done. I had my shot. God gave me an opportunity. I blew it. So I guess I'm just going to have to wander through the wilderness marked as a heretic or as somebody to be avoided. God's not quick to discard you. God is a God of restoration. He tells Moses to chisel 2 new stone tablets. When the Lord appears to him, he says, Yahweh the Lord. He's announcing himself. He's introducing himself, so to speak. The God of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. He could, at this moment, flex his authority. He could talk about his might, his power. He could go on and rehearse all the things that he did for Israel and put them in their place and make them to feel little and to feel small, and he would be justified in doing so. He could talk about his capacity to destroy them. But instead, he says who he is, Yahweh the Lord, and then he says who he is, the God of compassion and mercy. The ESV says it this way. It doesn't say Yahweh the Lord. It says the Lord, the Lord. The language there being repetitive to show that he wants to be intimate and personal and close. And instead of compassion and mercy, he says a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. What does this mean? Well, mercy means not giving us the punishment that we deserve. I remember one time trying to illustrate this idea for McKenna. I don't think it stuck. But I gave her timeout, and then I sat in timeout. So you get 10 minutes timeout. And I was like, oh, here's a good, insightful, cool dad opportunity. Instead, I'm going to sit in timeout myself. And I sat there for 10 minutes. I don't think it stuck. But that's the idea. There is something that we have earned. Romans tells us that the wages of sin is death. What is a wage? A wage is something that you've earned. And so if you work for a certain dollar amount, per hour you work an hour, you've earned that amount. If you sin, you've earned death. God is merciful in that instead of giving us what we deserve, he withholds it. His grace is found in that not only does he withhold punishment that we are deserving of, but he gives us blessings that we also don't deserve. He gives us things that we haven't earned. The child who maybe breaks something that was expensive and comes saying, "Can I have a new one?" Grace is saying, "Sure, you can have it." And when establishing who God is to Israel, they've seen his might, they've seen his power. They know he would be justified in snapping their fingers and having the ground open up, swallowing. That's something he's known to do. And when he's back with Moses again, the first thing he does is say, "I'm the God of compassion and mercy." When you introduce yourself to people, some of us will start by saying what we do. I don't. I met a gentleman at the library earlier this week, and we talked for a little while. And some people were like, "He goes to the library?" And when he asked what I did, I said, "I'm a pastor at a church in the Hazelwood area." He said, "Well, you don't look like a pastor to me." And I was like, I was waiting for what the next part was going to be. And he was like, "You look like a good, regular fella." And I thought, I'm still not sure how to receive that, but but oftentimes we will lead with what we want to be known for. If someone's proud of their career, and that's not to say I'm not proud of what I do, they may say, "Oh, my name's so-and-so, I'm an executive at wherever." Or they might say, or if you're at a wedding, they'll introduce themselves and they'll say, "Hey, I'm so-and-so, I'm a friend of the groom," or "I'm a friend of the bride," whatever they think establishes and justifies their presence and getting to know them. When God says who he is, the thing he leads with, the things he wants us to know about him, is his compassion and mercy. I know I might be camping out here for a little bit, but I think this is important. Imagine having all power in the universe, being able to do anything, setting that thought aside and saying, "I'm God and I want to love you." That's a powerful, powerful sentiment. I'm sure some of us can identify, and I promise I'm going to move on from this idea, where maybe you've gone to a business and someone was just real good to you. They gave you incredible customer service, and you're thinking, "Man, whoever that person is needs a raise." And you go and you tell the manager, and they go, "Oh, well, he owns the place." All right. And they never mentioned it. They never said. They were just there loving and serving. God does mention his authority. I think he's justified to do that. But he leads with who he is, because that's what he wants us to know. Can I challenge you, if we're to be people who reflect God's compassion, that's what we lead with, is compassion. Now, I will say, God's word, when he speaks, it's a little more trustworthy than us. So he gets to say, "I'm a God of compassion and mercy," and that's good enough. I don't advise that you introduce yourself and say, "Hey, I'm Jim and I'm compassionate and love you." Like that might not go well. But in your interactions with people, lead with a heart of compassion. Lead with a merciful heart. God is slow to anger. Our verse says, "I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness." God is patient. He doesn't rush to judgment. He doesn't rush to punishment. That's why we can have this campaign that we have coming up at Easter time to say, "Hey, listen, it does not matter what you have done. God is not mad at you." Does God have anger? Yes, he has anger. It exists. But he does not hold us to our worst moments. He does not hold us to the things that we've done wrong. But sometimes Christians have a hard time reflecting that quality. When we are wronged or when something has been done to us, we hold it as a justification to not want to share the love that God has given us, to reflect the compassion that he's given to us. By identifying ourselves with God, by bearing his name, when he reveals something of himself, our task is to let that part of his spirit be reflected in us. So if we say, I'm somebody who follows God, and God says, I am slow to anger, that puts the goal for us to be slow to anger. He talks of his steadfast, unfailing love and faithfulness. This is love that is not established because he already loved us, but this is love that is solidified in a covenant. What does that mean? It's not dependent on us. It is something he has brought to the equation. Why did he bring it to the equation? Because it's part of his very nature. It is who he is. It will be there no matter what. I have a bad habit, and you've probably seen it reflected in this time of going into God's word sometimes, where I make a joke where a joke may not have fit. It's a coping mechanism. When I get uncomfortable or feelings get too real, it's what I do. That is a discipline I can work on, but I'm telling you, if I make a weird joke, it's not because of anything you've done. It is part of my nature. It's going to be there no matter what. It's the same as a parent or a grandparent may feel towards their kids or grandkids who maybe have slighted them, who have told them they have nothing, they want to have nothing to do with them. Things that, if you were to tally it up on a worldly scoreboard, would justify somebody in saying, well, after what they've done, I don't have to love them. And while that may be true, it's in a mother's nature to love. It's in a father's nature to love. And it does not matter what the child does or says, it will be there. Now, I say that acknowledging that there may be people in the room who even hear that analogy and say, well, that's not the mother or father I grew up with or that I had. Just as an aside, can I tell you that and please, this can be a loaded statement, and this is not something just to write the grief away or write the things away that happened. But that is a result of broken people living in a broken world. And that the compassion that I'm talking about, if you'll allow it to operate in your life, will show you the nature of what a father is supposed to be. Will show you the nature of what a mother is supposed to be. It presents a challenging introspective for us. We see that God is a God of expectation. He is a God of standard. He lays out a standard for us to meet. We also see that people through Israel at this point are prone to mess it up. Sometimes very, very, very quickly. God has delivered these people from 400 years of bondage. He did 10 mighty miracles in their lives. He splits a sea so they can walk across on dry ground. He destroys an army on their behalf. And he says, hey guys, let's put a ring on it. Establishes the covenant. 2 weeks after the honeymoon, they've messed it up. If it were a marriage, someone would say it was grounds for divorce. In some states, they would probably waive the 1-year separation period and say, no, this is totally justified. You're good to go. And they would call it done. Some of us have had God do amazing things in our lives. He's came through for us, and we've celebrated. We thanked him. We walk away from it, and somewhere, maybe maybe really too close to the situation than we're proud to admit we mess up, and we beat ourselves up and say, how can I see God do that and then do this? I would say to you, that is a worthwhile thought exercise. I'm not telling you, oh no, you're good, just keep going. That is a reflection that is worth having. But what I will tell you is that whatever he did for you, as big as it may be, it is not nearly, by our own estimation, by our standards, as bad as 40 days after he parted an ocean for us, or a little over 40 days. 40 days after the covenant's established, after doing miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle, fashioning your own God. And despite the severity of what the Israelites have done, when it comes time to sit down and talk about it, if you're, it's the stage of life I'm in. I'm sorry for all the parent analogies. When a kid does something wrong, eventually you let them brood in their room for a while, and then you come in and you have the conversation. When it comes time to talk about it, he doesn't send them out to pick their own switch. He doesn't talk about how terrible the thing they did was. He says, I am a God of compassion and mercy. If you've seen God move in your life and then screwed it up, can I challenge you? If you haven't gone back and had the literal come to Jesus meeting with Jesus, can I encourage you that the first thing he may want to say to you is, I'm a God of compassion and mercy, of steadfast love and faithfulness. I'm slow to anger. No matter how bad you've messed up, you're not too far gone from me. But that does present this tension between mercy and justice. Exodus 34:7, he says, I lavish unfailing love to 1,000 generations. I forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin. That's good. Love for 1,000 generations. Forgiveness for inequity, rebellion, and sin. Then it shifts. But I do not excuse the guilty. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children and grandchildren, and the entire family is affected. Even children in the third and fourth generations. If God is a just God, and he is a just God, he cannot ignore sin. So what do we do with this? That there's a tension there. Compassion, mercy, and justice. What do we do with the tension between mercy and justice? Well, for us, God resolved that tension when Jesus died on the cross. His justice was carried out through the sacrifice of Jesus, and so we get to live in the mercy. But that being said, I lay the sins of the parents upon their children, grandchildren, and the entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations. Does that mean that I'm guilty of the sins that my father has committed? No. What that does mean is that sin has consequences. You are not guilty of your father's sins, but you may live to carry the consequences of your father's sin. We hear this conversation oftentimes when we talk about racism in America. And we'll hear people say, well, my family didn't own any slaves. I didn't own any slaves. And that's all well and good. But if we trace history, we can see, well, yeah, maybe you're a saint, but the sins of your great-grandfather have affected this person. And we're just having the conversation of what do we do with that? So when we see God say, I lay the sins of the parents upon their children and grandchildren, and the entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generation, that means that the things that you do, while God will forgive you, there is restoration. We do live in a broken, fallen world. And we do bear bear the consequences of sins of people who've come before us. And that while we are people who can walk in freedom and mercy, that does not give us license to sin more. Should we sin more so that grace may abound? No. Why? Because the things you do, while will be forgiven, can and will have consequences. I'm sure if we look back, any one of us can identify places in our lives that would have been different if somebody before us had done the right thing. Does that mean God can't forgive that person? No, it doesn't mean that. He absolutely can forgive that person. But that does mean I, 1, 2, or 3 generations later, have to deal with what happened. But here's the amazing thing. We see this when we look back at the Israelites. The tablets are broken, right? They are destroyed. Everybody has to deal with the consequences. But what does God do? He says, chisel new tablets. I'll restore what is broken. Does that mean that while we live under the consequences of sins of those who have gone before us, or if we have potentially generated consequences for those who will come after us, does that mean, well, that's broken, that can never be fixed? Absolutely not. You may so oftentimes in spiritual circles, you'll hear things of generational curses. Does that mean that you are cursed and your son will carry this and your sons will carry this? Not necessarily. What it does mean is somebody along the way sinned, and the next person didn't overcome the repercussions of that sin. The next person didn't overcome the repercussions of that sin. The next person didn't overcome the repercussions of that sin. But somebody went up and said, God, will you make new tablets? And so what I say that to say, I want you to feel the weight of the fact that second, third, and fourth generation of children will feel the consequences. He will lay the sins before them, that can happen, but that is heavy and that is real. But you can also come to God with a couple rocks and a chisel and say, God, will you do something? And he's faithful to do it. Ezekiel 18:20 clarifies this. He says, the person who sins is the one who will die. The child will not be punished for their parent's sin, and the parent will not be punished for the child's sin. Righteous people will be rewarded for their own righteous behavior, and wicked people will be punished for their own wickedness. So we have yes and. Yes, we have justice and mercy and compassion. That is all there. But we also have consequence for sin. Ultimately, punishment for the transgressor, but then also consequences for those who are around them. Why? Because we're a community. That means that if I sin, the consequences of sin don't happen in isolation. It affects all of us. Now, if I sin, does that mean Eileen, with her newly minted ordination, is going to face eternal punishment for what I've done? No. Will she be affected by my sin? Absolutely. Absolutely. So what does this mean? We started talking about compassion. Well, if we are to reflect God's compassion of mercy and justice, we can look at another way in Romans 3:26. It says, for he was looking ahead and including them in what he would do in this present time. God did this to demonstrate his righteousness, for he himself is fair and just, and he makes sinners right in his sight when they believe in Jesus. God is both just and the justifier through Jesus. You can imagine a judge sentencing a guilty criminal, then stepping down from the bench and going to jail to serve the sentence himself. What does that mean for us? Well, that means as people who reflect God's compassion. Does that mean we just look over every wrong that happens and be the nice person and love them anyway? No, that's not what it means. God identifies sin. He calls out sin. But just as he himself identifies with mercy and compassion, that's how he leads with himself. We don't force people to be identified by the wrongdoing they've done to us. Instead, we identify ourselves with God by leading with mercy and compassion. coming to a close here. Exodus 34, 8 and 9 says, Moses immediately threw himself to the ground and worshipped. He said, O Lord, if it is true that I have found favor with you, then please travel with us. Yes, this is a stubborn and rebellious people, but please forgive our iniquity and our sins and claim us as your own special possessions. What's the response to compassion and mercy? Well, the first response is worship. Moses goes to his knees in surrender. Our response to compassion and mercy is to surrender our own lives to reflect God's heart for people. What's the second thing Moses does? He intercedes. He prays for his people. Moses was justifiably furious when he came off the mountain and saw them worshiping a calf made by themselves. He could have fallen to his knees and said, oh God, spare me. Do what you will with those dummies who made expensive Play-Doh. But if you'll spare me. But in a response to God's own compassion and mercy, he had compassion and mercy on his fellow man. He interceded for them himself. So how do we respond? What does that mean for us? Well, one, we worship God. We worship God for who he is, because he is a God of compassion and mercy, because he is just, because he is enthroned above all things. We reflect on our own attitude, on our own heart, to see, does our heart reflect the compassion and mercy that God himself leads with? And then we pray for others. We intercede for other people. Mr. Steve, if you'd give me a little bit of reflection music. I want to give you, and then avail yourself for prayer if you would. I'm going to invite our two Steves and our newly ordained prayer warrior to come and make themselves available for prayer if you would. I'd invite you to 3 responses today. The first response is surrender. Is to worship the Lord. Maybe you just need some time with him. And the Lord has used this passage to reveal the depth of his mercy and compassion. And you say, you know what? I don't really have a grudge against anybody. I'm not really upset with anything. But that is amazing, and God deserves my worship for it. I invite you to take a few moments down here to worship. The second worship option I'd like to give you is to intercede for somebody else. My hope is that, as we've talked about the Come Home series coming up, and just as a person who loves other people, that you have somebody on your heart that you'd like to see the Lord do a work in. I'd invite you to come and do as Moses did and intercede for that person. Pray for that person. Join with one of our people up here in prayer for this lost person. And the third is this. There's a bunch of familiar faces in this room, but I never want to assume anything. Maybe you are not living a life that is a reflection of God's mercy. Maybe you haven't responded to God's compassion and mercy, or maybe you've strayed away from it. And you need to establish a relationship with Jesus again for the first time, or maybe reestablish a relationship with Jesus. Maybe the only thing that has brought you here is tradition and habit. But can I tell you that even if you feel like you've broken what God's done in your life, if you feel like that relationship has been severed beyond repair, that God would invite you to chisel new tablets. He's willing to restore what is broken. So if my folks have invited for prayer would be willing to be available, I'm going to pray.